Hello everyone, I'm Nick Atkin, Chief Exec here at Yorkshire Housing, and you're listening to Raising the Roof podcast, the show that brings business leaders and industry experts together to unpick the hot topics in housing and the world beyond housing as well. And today we're talking about one of my favourite topics, which is about recruitment, but also retention. Joining me today, because it is a hot topic, is not my usual two guests, but three, all of whom bring their own unique knowledge and perspective on this topic area. First up is James Layton. James, despite his youthful good looks, has got 14 years experience of working in the housing sector. He's the CEO of Anderson James. And that, for those of you who don't know it, is a business that's centered around both the private and the public sector housing market. And he has a team of about 35 people that serve the sector nationally. Now, unfortunately, James has got through our normal recruitment, very rigorous recruitment processes, because he's from the wrong side of the Pennines in Manchester. So normally we don't let those dirty Lancastrians into a Yorkshire podcast, but we've made an exception because we like him and because he knows his stuff. So welcome aboard, James, who is a fellow podcaster. He hosts the Housing Industry podcast, which I genuinely was really chuffed to be a guest on recently. And by the sounds of it, I was lucky my invite made it all the way to Yorkshire, because James struggles with anything on the right side of the Pennines. But on a serious note, James is an active ambassador of diversity within the sector and is on a real mission to shine a light on all the great things that our sector does, and that's probably needed more now than at any time before. He's created several diversity strategies for housing associations that have been fully implemented, and he's also led to massively improved diversity and inclusion across their business as a result of that. So that's a little bit about James. My next guest is Suresh Lal. And now Suresh, with even better youthful good looks, is approaching his 16th year working with the social housing sector. So the only thing I take from this is that the longer you work in recruitment in the social housing sector, the younger you look. Suresh has worked across a whole vast array of housing associations. He's got a contact book to die for every time I see him. He rattles off a whole list of people who I've been trying to get to see for years, and he has coffee with them on a regular basis. And he's made a number of key interim appointments across the sector, including the interim chief exec for the Homes and Communities Agency, which was a precursor to our existing funding agency, the Homes England. Now, Suresh works across all disciplines, but unsurprisingly, given the financial climate that we're in, his current portfolio is weighted a little bit more towards finance. So if you're one of those finance people, Suresh is looking for you, but he's also looking for anybody involved in building safety and governance as well. So you really want to know a little bit more about Suresh, don't you? The real stuff, not the business stuff. Well, firstly, I have to say, he's the best dressed person in housing. Whenever we meet, I always end up asking him where he's got either an item of clothing or his shoes or a bag from. But apart from being a snappy dresser, he's also a massive petrol head and a huge Formula One fan. And he's been to several races across Europe. And he's even revealed to us that there are negotiations at home about a trip to Vegas for the new race there next year. So good luck with those negotiations, Suresh. And last but by no means least is our very own Sarah Hutchinson, who after 10 years in HR working in financial services, she made absolutely the right decision to join Yorkshire Housing during lockdown in 2020. And I suppose joining at that point in time meant that she had to think very differently about how we did things almost from day one. And that included recruitment. And it is interesting that 1 in 3 of our 750 colleagues have joined us since lockdown started. So clearly she was doing something right at some point. She's been instrumental in finding different ways to assess candidates to make applying for a job at Yorkshire Housing a lot easier and a lot more inclusive, and that might well be something we talk about shortly. And, you know, she gets some great feedback from candidates, so very much the proof is in the pudding. And I'm also pleased to say that she's joined me. She's donned her running shoes, and this year she ran her first 10K for our charity of the year, the Fab Yorkshire Air Ambulance. Outside of work, Sarah is mum to a 3-year-old, and so she's got immense knowledge of Bob the Builder and Batman, but I think it's fair to say today we're probably going to focus more on her HR and recruitment experience. So there's our guests. Now let's get into the issues and start talking about all things recruitment and retention. So I'm going to kick things off really, and bearing in mind that everybody on the call has done a lot of work around diversity and inclusion. I suppose I'm really interested in terms of how we can use some of those skills and experience to recruit in a truly inclusive way to attract the very best talent. And I suppose to kick this one off, come to you first if I can, James.
Yeah, I looked at this and I think, firstly, coming across the sector over the last couple of years, I think we've lost a little bit of impetus in some of these areas, especially given the other challenges that we now face in housing. But I think the first thing that we would always recommend to a business is to look at what your actual EVP is. And I think a lot of people that are looking for roles in the sector at the moment are probably using your website, your Twitter, the way you talk, the languages, all the different things that you will use to attract people to your organization. And the thing that I see quite a lot is that there's not enough case studies and stories and success stories on some of these websites to understand, like, is that employer a really inclusive place for somebody to work? And I think one thing that we've assessed recently is we use a little bit of video technology within our interview process. And without naming names and companies and stuff, what we've observed over that time using videos, if I say that out of 100 videos, those that come from different backgrounds or different diversities, they generally don't get viewed at the same length as those that are white, British. And I think that we've got a piece of work to do in terms of the unconscious bias and the education within our teams to make sure that we are genuinely looking to recruit in an inclusive way and that we're giving opportunities to all within all diversity spectrums. And I think the first thing that I think we can do in that is to look at potential within the sector. You know, I'm sure Suresh is the same. We go and speak to chief executives and exec directors quite a lot of the time, and it's the same question that comes up. You know, we want a diverse shortlist. We want to see certain characteristics on the shortlist, but actually what ends up happening is that they pick the same person that they were always going to pick from that shortlist because they had the 10 years in asset management, they had the 15 years in finance. And actually, I think as a sector at the moment, we probably need to start looking at how can we look at other industries, other sectors? How can we bring people in from other environments if the role doesn't need a specific skill? Some businesses are really demonstrating that and others are a long way away from that. But certainly we've looked at adverts. And I think one thing that the sector sometimes has got wrong is that we start to do things like, can you send us blind CVs? We don't want to have bias within our organization. And I feel like all that happens in that situation is that you delay the bias, you know, and actually there's an education piece internally to make sure that your organization is doing everything it can to be inclusive in the way that it recruits. So yeah, that'd be my first thoughts anyway.
It was really interesting then what you said about sort of blind CVs and blind applications, but then just that all that does is delay the buyer. So how do we break that cycle? Have you got any tips or tricks for in terms of practically so that, you know, my worry, James, is that we're in this position in 20 years' time. We were talking about this 20 years ago, and it feels like we've made some incremental sort of improvements and changes, but I don't think we've really made the wholesale change that many of us were at that time were hoping for. So any thoughts on tips or tricks then, you know, that people could employ to try and break that cycle?
I think we've got to look inside our businesses to start with and look at different groups of individuals that can help us design our recruitment process. That's the first thing. And I think very often I see that our recruitment processes are created by the same people that don't understand their unconscious bias. You know, I've gone through a massive journey in the last 2 or 3 years to understand my unconscious bias, and I'm still on that journey and learning. The other thing that we've started to do a lot more of is when we're looking at panel recruitment, and sometimes that happens more at executive level than it does at your lower level roles. We've got to look at diverse panels that are going to interview and that are going to be part of that recruitment process so that colleagues that don't want to have unconscious bias can get a better process put in place so that we're recruiting the right people. And I think that's one thing we've seen have the biggest impact. The other thing, as I've said, is that we start to look outside of the sector. You know, if you're recruiting a chief executive in the current crop of housing and you're looking for diversity, as an example, well, obviously, like, you're not going to necessarily find that. So we've got to look at ways that we can promote within and look at other sectors to bring in those inclusive skills and those diverse skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most impactful training sessions I went on was earlier this year around Easter, and it was a subject, interestingly, of an earlier podcast in this season with Akin from AKD, and he really sort of lifted the lid on unconscious bias, and I think that's had a massive impact through our organization. Definitely recognize some of what you said there about recruiting for attitude and not skills. I'm not really bothered about whether somebody's got 20 years experience of doing X. I'm more interested in terms of whether they've got the right behaviors and the right values set to sort of really, deliver that customer obsessed business that we're aiming to achieve. And I know many others are as well. So that's great sort of kick off there. Suresh, can I come to you? So same question really, just, from what you've seen and experienced, where are you at on this, and where do you think, housing could go, and how could we get there?
I think that's a really good question. I think James has covered a lot of ground there in a relatively short space of time. So if I can add a kind of personal angle to it, if you don't mind, which is looking at organizations, and this is also about me trying to find individuals. If I look at organizations first, the ones that have been very successful at this, or are becoming more successful at this, are organizations where they almost take the inclusivity and diversity aspect out for a second, and we put business into that process instead. And what I mean by that is, let's, for the sake of argument, and I hope this never happens to you, Nick, that you got in trouble with the regulator. Something goes drastically wrong at Yorkshire Housing. What would you do in that scenario? You would create a process where you would have a plan of action. You would create, you would get a number of individuals from around the business, and you would fix that problem as soon as you possibly can. And you would have a plan and a set of milestones and goals that you need to reach to regrade your business back upwards, or to achieve whatever success looked like. So let's take those emotive words, inclusivity and diversity, and put them back into that model. We can, and why shouldn't we, be doing the same things? If we're sat there as an organization and looking at ourselves thinking, we don't look that representative, how are we going to change that? And I don't mean just a tokenistic 1 or 2 appointments to make it look like you've done some diverse hiring. That's not sustainable, and it's the wrong thing to do. This should be a long-term plan, cultural change within an organization, with those milestones and with those goals that are achievable, to make a sustained change over time. So again, let's, for the sake of argument, if you've got nothing today, let's hire 1 individual by the end of this year, and that becomes 2. But you've got a goal of achieving, let's say, 20% of the board being from a diverse background in 4 years' time, or whatever it may be. It's going to be a long and hard process, but at least you've got a plan of how you're going to get there. This isn't just pick it up and play and just adding the odd one person here and there. For me to find diverse candidates becomes tricky because it's interims. And I've got to find somebody who can fix the problem for you tomorrow, but I've also only got about a day and a half to turn that problem around. So I almost have to have those people in my portfolio already. So I'm trying to do that before any of you even give me a job. So I'm already out there speaking to people who potentially might want to be interims one day, or who are coming towards the end of their careers and saying, you're not retiring, come to me, I'm going to use you in a different capacity. And we're trying to build a more diverse range of interim management consultants from that way of doing things.
Fantastic, and really, really sort of usefully builds on some of those earlier points that James raised. So no pressure, Sarah. We're now going to come to you. What's your take on this?
I think being inclusive, Nick, has been massive on our agenda over the last few years, and the way that the market is at the moment and how difficult it is to attract the best people with the amount of jobs that are out there, it's just becoming even more important. And having that diversity in our workforce is just really essential, in terms of how we're supporting our customers and how we're delivering the business strategy. We've been working on lots of things recently around how we just make it really easy for people to apply for roles. Long gone are the days where we're asking for a long application form and a CV, and then a 5-stage application process. We're just making it really easy. So we've had a really big successful campaign recently where we've just asked people to register their interest, and then we simply just pick up the phone to them and have a conversation and make sure that actually, are we right for them, and are they right for us?
Wow, that's a big shift in approach. How do people like me, who've perhaps been through the employment process for a few years, how do they sort of respond and cope with that?
A lot of people are finding it really refreshing. Everybody that's been out there looking for a job, it's kind of, you have to put that time aside to start searching through the internet to find a role, and then you click on to apply, and the application stage is just takes forever, and it can be really disheartening, especially when you get an email back at the end of it saying, I'm sorry, you're not successful, and you've wasted 45 minutes filling in an application form. People coming into the workforce, they have different expectations now, that they're not of the generation that have been used to that way of recruiting. So we've got to meet those expectations.
So I'm clearly in a generation that you're not looking for anymore, Sarah. So I'll not be applying. Although
we'll absolutely find a job for you, Nick. Don't worry.
That's what worries me, Sarah. That's what worries me.
I think the other thing that we've been doing differently is around how we're assessing people. So, historically, people have been brought in for an interview. We're asking people that actually, when they start work, they don't need to turn up in a suit and tie, because that's not what's expected of them. But actually, through the assessment process, that's what's kind of expected. So, really sort of ripping up the rule book with that and looking at things differently, getting them to do practical assessments rather than an interview. Some people just don't fare well in an interview, and actually, why are we putting them through that when that task or that sort of environment isn't what they're going to be working in?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because the traditional recruitment process, basically, you end up recruiting the best actor on the day. Is it more about getting to know the person rather than what they've done in the past? Is that where the focus is at, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's about understanding people's values and what's important to them, and understanding whether actually their values fit with the values that we're looking for at Yorkshire Housing. I think that's really important. A lot of skills you can train, and people can learn. The experience is obviously important. It's really important because we need that balance. But definitely, from a values point of view, that is a really important thing. And just getting to know someone and having a conversation with them.
Yeah. And how's that helping Yorkshire Housing be a more inclusive employer?
It's about opening it up to more people. So people that might be put off by a lengthy application process or might not fare well necessarily in sort of your formal interview situations. It sort of opens it up to allowing people to be their best and show their best in those scenarios. We've done things like for some of our trades roles is basically just bring them into a void property and show us how you would work a boiler or how you do the electrics. We don't necessarily need you to sit around a table and tell us that you can do it, because actually your qualifications show you can. We want to see you do it. We want to see how you interact with customers, because that's really important as well, because the people that are out on the front line, they are interacting with customers on a day-to-day basis. So we need them to be able to do that and to have that sort of right mindset rather than just being able to do the technical bit of the job.
Thanks for that. That's really good. Let's move this along a bit. Now we've warmed up and really stoked the fire of conversation. And let's move to the whole sort of point around flexibility and particularly in terms of how we recruit and retain the very best talent at a time when there's about 1.3 million job vacancies in the UK. From all of your perspectives, how flexible really is the recruitment landscape, and how important is flexibility when you are trying to attract candidates? So Suresh, we'll come to you first this time, please.
Again, I think I might have a slightly different view to James and to Sarah on this one, because the vast majority of the work that they're doing is on a permanent basis. So on the interim side of things, flexible working has existed for many, many years. I've built an interim network now over the last 16, 17 years. And for many years, the guys that work with me, the people that work with me, go wherever I send them. They're there to fix the problem. So I have individuals who live in Liverpool, but have worked in London for many, many years. Likewise, they might be living in Somerset, but I've sent them up to Manchester and Leeds. So they have worked in a context of, you leave the house on a Monday morning and don't come back till Thursday or Friday evening, weekend at home, and then you play that same game week in, week out. So when lockdown happened and people started to move to this hybrid fashion, it was working from home to begin with, wasn't it? Completely. They were quite easily kind of flipped to that. And actually it worked for them. It was in their advantage. They didn't have to go and travel and stay over for nights on end. Again, the hybrid fashion works really, really well for them because they can travel long distances, stay over 1 or 2 nights now rather than 4 or 5, and come back and spend much more time with families and at home. So the flexibility side for interims has been a really big plus because we're getting time back. We've always worked in a fashion of going wherever the work is. So actually now we can use that resource in a different way. I think there's another part to that, which is around how does that impact on an organization in terms of flexible resource? There is a trend that I'm starting to see, which is people are retrenching from being too flexible. Yeah, don't come to the office at all. Actually, there are roles now where I think people should be in the office. And what do I mean by that? If you look at some of the asset management or some of the property related issues, we've got the dreaded 2 words damp and mold at the moment, which are high on everyone's agenda. We need people who are there on site, who can see, smell, touch the damp and the mold, and see what extent the problem is. I think that also gives reassurance to the customers that we're doing something, where visibly, physically, we're there to look at it. Again, if I've got these scenarios where I've got somebody who's based in Devon, but the job is based in Newcastle, and then they're physically not going to be on site, I don't think they would have the same impact. I don't think they could do that role as well as somebody who was easier to get onto the sites and easier to get to those locations. So we're definitely starting to see clients now ask us for somebody who's more local to their offices and their stock.
That's great. And that's why I very much came to you first, because I knew that interim market pre-COVID, you have to work in a different way, don't you? So James, can I come to you next? Because I am really interested in sort of this war for talent at the moment. And, have you seen a shift in applicants in terms of what their expectations are, for example, from employers, and whether how much weight are they putting around flexibility of the working offer versus, say, for example, salary?
On the back of Suresh's point, actually, I think it's changed. So if you'd have asked me this question 12, 18 months ago, I would have given you a very different answer, I think. People are very open and honest about flexibility now. So it's not a mute point anymore. It used to be kind of, do the offer, don't the offer. Most businesses in our sector offer a variety of flexibility options. I think if you look at it from a company perspective, and I think one thing that Yorkshire Housing do really well without blowing smoke is that your offering's clear. Okay, like work's a place that you do, not a place you go, I think is your saying that I remember from when we had the podcast. Yeah. And I think that's a great way to be really clear about what your offering is. What we're realizing in the marketplace at the moment is that some people love being in an office and some people love working from home, and there's a hybrid between the two. And actually the sector in some cases went too quickly to, right, let's get rid of all our offices, sell off all of our property, everyone works from home now. They're struggling. But on the flip of that coin, those businesses that said you need to be in the office 5 days a week are also struggling. What we're learning from this experience is that employment's about choice. And actually, some people love collaboration, some people love to work from home, and that's role specific, that's generation specific in some cases, and that's what your service to the community is as well. Like we wouldn't ask someone to do a remote job that's working with our tenants and our residents, but what I'm starting to see is people want to see colleagues in person, and they're enjoying that personal interaction more than maybe they were 2 years ago when people were happy to work from home. What I'm seeing most is that people want to be able to be engaged, regardless of whether that's remotely or in an office environment. They want to be engaged by their management team, their leadership team, and they want to feel connected to the culture of the organisation. And that's never changed. But I think one thing that companies have got to be better at is being clear on their offering. You can't 1 minute be offering flexibility and the next minute telling people to be in the office, because we have had some cases where people have taken roles with flexibility and they're now being told we want you in the office 5, and that's not the right approach either. For me, there's a really healthy balance, and one thing that I think is really good is collaboration's king, and everyone wants to be able to collaborate, whether that be remotely or physically. We'll see businesses, as they start to struggle in the new environment, to start to try and bring people back to the office, and that could be a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely get that. And I think you're right about it's giving people choice, and I think far too many employers treat their employees like children, very paternalistic, tell them what to do, when they can do it, how they can do it. The one thing COVID taught us is actually to sort of break those shackles and reset some of that relationship. And I think for me, certainly at Yorkshire Housing, where we have gone hard and fast on this, but we have got, as you said, James, we've got a fantastic collaboration space, which we opened in June 2022. The point of that is about retaining really good people as well as attracting really good people, because, and I guess this goes against both your business models, so apologies for this, but my take on it is, why do people let really good people leave? Because actually, for every person who leaves, that post, that role is in effect not operating at optimum levels for 12 months. because somebody applies for a job, so they're immediately distracted, probably only 90% sort of focused on the job. Then, they're successful, they hand the notice in. Normally that's a month, 2 months. Then you sort of go, oh, right, we've got to get around to recruiting to that role. So you start a recruitment process, that's another 3 months. Then 2 months, then somebody starts maybe sort of 6-8 weeks later. And then it takes them sort of between 3 and 6 months to get fully effective. So for every single role that becomes vacant, you are losing a year's worth of productivity. And I never quite understand why organizations behave in a way, I suppose, that encourages people almost to leave and want to go and sort of, find something else, something better. So great points there. Thank you. I'm now going to come across to our resident Yorkshire Housing guru on all things flexible working and recruitment. Sarah, back to you.
Yeah, flexibility, as you quite rightly know, Nick, it's again been massive on our agenda, and I think really sort of getting people to understand what we mean by flexibility. It's not just doing compressed hours. My personal view is actually compressed hours can sometimes be more restrictive, but I appreciate it works for some people. It's not just flexibility in terms of hours, it's in terms of where we're working and how people are working. And it's a real fine balance to get, really, to make sure that everyone's working and being productive whilst having that flexibility. When you're talking to candidates, that have applied for roles, flexibility is really important. But I think it's now become an expectation of people rather than a benefit. I know a lot of organisations used to sell flexible working as a benefit. Actually, I think now it's just a given. And I was reading something the other day actually about by 2025, 65% of the workforce will be Generation Z and millennials, which is massive, really, if you think about it. And so it's about understanding what's really important to those generations with the world of work. And as I say, flexibility to those people is just expected as a given. So we've got to look at more. So whilst I do think flexibility is changing the sort of the recruitment landscape, I think it's more than that. We've got to do more.
Picking up on some of that, we're in a position where we've got in excess of 1 million vacancies in the UK at the moment, and still record low levels of unemployment. So what are you doing to make Yorkshire Housing stand out from the crowd and attract that very top talent?
We're doing a few things, really, Nick, from things such as, our brand is helping massively. It's really eye-catching in terms of the adverts that we're doing through some of your more standard platforms like LinkedIn. We're really sort of getting the attraction through that way, but also thinking really differently. So thinking about the type of role it is that we're advertising and that we're looking for, and thinking about, okay, so where are the people that want these roles all hanging out when they're looking for jobs? Using Facebook campaigns have been massively successful for some of our trades roles. And, although we are trying to go digital wherever we can, actually sometimes just putting a poster up in the local merchants counters, I know you probably won't like that, Nick, maybe the same paper, but you know what, we've got to be inclusive, and we've got to sort of make ourselves seen in the areas where those people are on a daily basis.
Yeah, I presume you're not putting those up in any merchants in Lancashire, though, are you, Sarah? Because we're a Yorkshire-based organisation, so we're inclusive, but we do draw the line at anybody from Lancashire, don't we?
Well, you do know I am from Lancashire.
I do, yeah. I'm winding you up. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing.
I drop a few local when I go home every now and again.
Okay, so we are running out of time, as is always the way on this podcast, partly because I talk too much and I don't sort of rein in my guests, but today's been great, and I didn't want to sort of jump in on some fantastic and rich points that are being sort of discussed here. But my final one, and this really is, I guess, for yourself, Suresh and James, I'm really intrigued why some employers choose not to advertise salaries. And from your sort of professional advisory point of view, what impact does that have on recruitment chances and opportunities for employers? So who wants to kick off? I'm not going to be prescriptive on this one, because I know Sarah wants to come in at the end, because I know she's got some strong views on this one. So one of you dive in first.
This is a really interesting point, especially in the public sector. In the private sector, it is cloak and daggers around salaries. Like, people don't advertise, they don't want to know. People are on different bandings, different salaries. In the public sector and in the housing associations, I don't understand it. I think we should be advertising salaries. I think we should be advertising packages, and we should be giving candidates the opportunity to decide whether to apply or whether not to apply based on all of the facts presented. Because all you end up doing is getting someone interested in an opportunity and then telling the salary at the end, and that puts them off for whatever reason. Or, and the flip of that, you're actually misleading someone into a process that doesn't want to be there. And I just think that we're not in a sector where people are paid massively different. I think the reason that companies aren't advertising salaries is because of external perception and where they benchmark against other organizations. But I'd like to see companies advertise salaries, and I think it would help the market and encourage more people to apply for roles. I wouldn't apply for a role if there wasn't a salary on it. So I'd want to know what I was getting involved in.
That says it all, doesn't it? So,
yeah.
Suresh, over to you.
So yeah, I think this aspect of advertising salaries, I think it started because it was a psychological scenario around attracting as much talent and being as inclusive as possible in the hiring process. I believe it came about because some of the studies were showing that men in particular would apply for roles above pay grades or above where they were, even if they only had half of the job description they could do or fulfill half of the desired and the essential criteria. Whereas females would be like, I don't think I can do that. The desirables and the essentials, I've only got some of those factors, and wouldn't apply. Or they might see the value of the figure, the salary, and say, well, it's pitched at 25, 30K more than what I'm on. I'm not going to apply for that role. And it was stopping some of the individuals applying for those roles because psychologically they'd already ruled themselves out. Whether they could do the job or not, they'd ruled themselves out. I think the impact of that, though, is, and I would agree with James and what he said there, would I apply for a job if I didn't know the salary? No, because actually I think it's gone the other way. You're not being inclusive. You're not actually telling the whole story. We often see roles that say competitive, and maybe that's because you don't want to tell your competitors what you're paying for the same role. I get that. But at the same time, I think you're going to end up getting applications pretty much from the same sets of people. You'll have a 25-year-old grad who's just come out of university who's still applying for chief executive roles because they think they can do everything. And then you've got others who still won't apply for the job because they're not sure or they're not confident enough to reach out for it. And that's where our role comes into play. You know, James and I will go and tap people on the shoulder more often than not to say, listen, I think you're strong enough and good enough to do this. Why haven't you applied? Or you should apply. So yeah, I'm definitely against the not advertising salaries. I'm not sure that it has the inclusive factors that people think it does.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to turn to Sarah now, who I know will be chomping at the bit for this one because I know she's got some strong views on it. So, Sarah, what's your take on it?
We absolutely advertise salaries, and I genuinely don't know why a company, an organisation would choose not to. You know, you talk about trust, you talk about openness, and actually that starts from the very moment that a candidate sees an application. It wastes the candidate's time, which is a bad experience. It wastes our time. I don't know, and it's something we will absolutely continue to do at Yorkshire Housing.
Yeah, I think you need to come off the fence, Sarah, and say what you really think and be a bit stronger in your views on some of this. So absolutely. Okay, so the sands of time are quickly running against us. So we're on to the quick fire round. So it's a really sort of quick and easy sort of answer to this. But as I know, all three of our guests are like big kids. What do you want to be when you grow up? Suresh, I'll come to you first.
Nick, I think you've been talking to my wife because she asked me the same question about when I'm going to grow up one day, what I'm going to do. But in all seriousness, if I think about it, what I'd really like to be as I grow older and grayer is just somebody that people can talk to, that people recognize I have some element of advice or something that I can pass on to them, that I would hear their voice, that I would give them honest feedback, opinions, that I wouldn't kind of judge them in their character, and that they could speak to me. And there's something that kind of bugs me. And I've often said this to close friends and to others and anybody who'll listen, actually, is I often see people posting these inspirational quotes on Instagram or wherever. And in my head, I'm thinking, don't post an inspirational quote, be one.
Oh.
Why are you posting somebody else's metaphors and lovely stories and ways of living? Be one. Be an inspiration to somebody.
Oh, what a great phrase. Lovely.
I know it's profound, Nick. You know, I always give you a soundbite whenever we speak.
You have just opened the door to banning me from Twitter, I think. Now, every time I say an inspirational quote, I'm going to have a rant.
If you are going to use that on Twitter, you have to use #Suresh's voice.
I will do. We'll get that trending, Suresh. We'll get it trending. Oh, James, how about you? What do you want to be when you grow up?
I don't know how to follow that now, to be honest. I think for me, it's all about, as I've said in the podcast, I'm working on my unconscious bias. I want to be a more empathetic, inclusive leader. And we're on a mission at Anderson James to create a real people over profit recruitment business. And that's my whole focus. If I get there, I'll be really proud. And that's what I'm aiming to do.
Great stuff. Great stuff. These weren't the answers I was expecting, actually. So,
yeah. I was going to say a superhero, and then I thought, I don't know where we're going with this.
I was expecting Formula One driver from us.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll go to Sarah and say, what do you want to be when you grow up, Sarah?
Nick, I think this one has got to be a professional shopper. I spend the majority of my time online shopping, and yeah, I think if somebody could offer me a job doing that for a living, I would absolutely bite their hand off.
Always a place for you in our procurement team, Sarah. Okay, so it's nearly time to close the door on this podcast. And I think just a quick few takeaways for me, apart from some of those final statements from particularly from Suresh and James and what they want to be when they grow up. Tone of voice, really important. Think differently about how you recruit and make it easy. Learn from other sectors where clearly this is working a lot better. And also, interestingly, that whole point that has resonated through about unconscious bias. And my reflection on that is unconscious bias is only unconscious when you don't know it's there. As soon as you know it's there, it's conscious bias, and that's a very different conversation. So I want to say a massive thank you to all three of our guests, and equally a massive thank you to you, the listeners, for choosing to tune into this episode. Please remember that all of our previous episodes from season 1 and indeed this season 2 are available via your usual podcast providers. Our next episode is all about well-being and how that can improve engagement. So please remember, hit subscribe and ensure you don't miss a thing. But for now, ta-ra.